This is the January Geometric webinar, Digital Marketing Trends to Watch in 2019. These are always fun ones to put together, always fun presentations as we gaze into our crystal ball, look at the year ahead, and try to figure out what new things need to be focused on that maybe are a little different than what we've looked at in years past. I think we've got some really interesting insights this year. Part of the process as we put these together, because we've done this pretty consistently over the last several years, is to look back at the previous year's predictions, see if we hit the mark, if we missed the mark, and really look to see how maybe some of those things have shifted from one year to the next. And so when we look back at the January webinar from last year, and again, another trends webinar, our big buckets were user experience and accessibility, and certainly that was a big issue last year, and really coming into the year with some lawsuits at the beginning of the year. Accessibility in particular had been a big focus. Findability, SEO, was a big one. The movement of more voice searching and all of these new Alexa devices and things like that were all delivered to people for the holidays that year before, suddenly became a much bigger piece of the picture and was really shifting what some of the search engines were doing from a search perspective. Health consumerism, it has been a big topic for a while, but I think has really over the last year or two hit the mainstream and become a big deal, not just something that we've been talking about and frankly hoping for a little bit. And we talked a bit about branded conversations last year as well. And as we look at our trends for this year, a lot of them are variations on these same themes, right? From year to year, we're not necessarily seeing entirely new things emerging. And again, we put together our trends for 2019 sort of independently of what we've seen in years past. But it is interesting in that the way that the world has evolved around some of these topics, some of them were still on the same path that we were talking about a year ago, and some of them, I think things are emerging that make us think about them in somewhat different ways as we go into 2019 as well. And so a lot of what we'll be talking about will be in similar themes, although I think some very new insights coming into this next year. One item that wasn't, and our first trend for this year, is the changing nature of competition. I think we've been feeling this in various ways over quite a few years here, but over the last year, there's been a lot of moves in the space from non-traditional competitors, right? We've seen a lot of movement in terms of big systems getting bigger, the merger and acquisition activity. We've seen organizations expanding organically into other markets. There's been a lot of shifting of the competitive space in the last couple of years. 2018 was a year when a lot of movement was made that starts to suggest more non-traditional competition. And it can be Amazon and Google making big moves around the space, or Apple making moves around things. We've seen a couple of these partnerships, the Amazon Berkshire JP Morgan venture, and we're still a little unclear exactly what they're going to be doing with that. But the announcement of that and putting Atul Gawande in as the CEO of that venture has gotten a lot of energy and attention. Big mergers, CVS and Aetna getting together, I think maybe the one that probably got the most chatter here over the last year. These things are all, I think, threatening to change the competitive dynamic in a way that's different than what we've been feeling in the past, right? If you're a health system and there's another health system and you've got some pros and cons and they've got some pros and cons, but they're starting to move into your space or vice versa, like that's competition that I think we've understood pretty well. When CVS, the largest drug chain in the country, I believe, and depending how you count, maybe the largest primary care provider as well, with all of the urgent care capacity that they have within their network, merging with a major health plan like Aetna, I think challenges us with potential for competition that feels very different. Folks that can rewrite the rules of how these things work, maybe the ability to lock patients in ways that we're just not prepared to adapt to. And so those sorts of things, I think, give us a little bit more challenge, a little bit more concern than some of the traditional competitive activity that we've seen in the past. And when we think about the way that an Apple or an Amazon have disrupted the spaces that they've been in, that they've moved in, I think that's well-placed concern. Amazon started in books, has gone through a number of other categories, has really revolutionized a lot of things there, has changed consumers' expectations around a lot of things in that process. I mean, think about it now. I know that I'm frustrated if I have to pay for shipping and if that shipping is going to be more than next day, right? If I have to like pay for 2 days shipping, like I'm not sure that I'm going to go through with this transaction anymore. That seemed like a normal thing just a couple of years ago. So now they start to move into the drug business, things like that. And we start to think, well, what could that mean? What could that change? How could that be different? What if everyone with Amazon Prime suddenly had free telehealth service and they were paying for it all with online, mail order pharmacy revenues, right? I mean, these things could shift things in very meaningful ways. Um, while inside the space, I think there's a lot of angst over these things. I think outside the space, there's actually a fair amount of excitement. I think consumers are frustrated with the way healthcare works. We are not moving fast enough to fix some of the fundamental problems that consumers see in our space. And so we start to see things like this Becker article, why Apple should buy Epic. Like people are so excited, have so much loyalty, have so much faith in brands like Apple. They're saying, hey, like buy these things that you can fix to make our lives better as healthcare consumers. And we should just be just as concerned about those kinds of things as we are about the moves that are actually in play. One example of how this is already happening in some spaces is Oscar. Now, Oscar is a startup. I think they're still considered a startup, health insurer. They started in New York State. They've now moved into a number of other neighboring states. And frankly, as you talk to people in the insurance space about where insurance is going and what the big moves are, it's hard to have those conversations where Oscar doesn't come up. Um, and this is from an article from a couple years ago about Oscar from Becker's. Um, and 10 things you should know about this Oscar thing. Number 4, it feels like it's straight out of the marketing copy, right? Oscar's founders set out to apply a design-centric approach to health insurance with a focus on improving the user experience in an industry that is notoriously complex and difficult to navigate. And I think the provider side of healthcare, which is where most of the people that I noticed on the call as we were getting ready to get started here are falling, we have those same kinds of problems. And so here comes this insurance company that's stepping in and saying, all right, like we recognize this problem. They also interviewed one of the founders, and of course, he put it, I think, in the language that is much more direct for the thing they're trying to accomplish. And you can imagine them sitting around and pitching to investors or whatever stage of the business, basically saying health insurance is such a mess that if we can make it suck just a little bit less, people will come flocking to us, right? And so that is what they are attempting to do. They're attempting to remove friction. They're trying to make it easier to work with them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to a large extent, it's working. I think something like 12% of the market for individual health insurance in New York. And as I mentioned, they've already moved into a number of other states. This is startup insurance from people mostly coming from outside of that space, making these kinds of changes. And you can see where these sorts of things could really disrupt things within the provider side of things as well, if we start to see some of this kind of movement into our space. I think there's also a lot of anxiety. Well, there is a lot of anxiety around some of these moves we're seeing. I think the way that they could disrupt our space could be very simple. And so it doesn't have to be these huge movements, doesn't have to necessarily be new companies coming up. This is something that Google was playing with a little bit last year, and sort of, I don't think it ever became live, but it was sort of a concept piece. But the idea that, hey, right from Google, you could maybe make an appointment with a doctor. And think about cutting out all of those things that you're trying to do to help people find the right doctor for them, to help make sure that you're presenting your doctors in the best light, to build out the information around that people use to make decisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in emotion, Google could very easily shortcut all of that, and they get the ability to tell that story in whatever way they feel they might want to. So I think, there are lots of things going on that really could shake our space if we don't improve things from an experience point of view. Um, and along the way, I think health systems have been making moves that aren't necessarily helping themselves in this space. I think we as healthcare organizations have real challenges around patient loyalty, and I think this is something that either or organizations have assumed they have huge patient loyalty or they assume no patient loyalty. The reality is somewhere in the middle. But advisory board has done some great work over the last few years looking at patient loyalty, and without getting too far into their methodology and things like that, they were looking at what they considered the most loyal group of patients. And even amongst those patients, 80% of them were splitters. And so even amongst the folks where systems felt like they really had a handle on these patients, that they were loyal to the system, so on and so forth, still splitting in a big way, 30% of their inpatient care happening outside their home system. Along the way, I think because health systems have really been pushing on the cost side of the equation, things are happening here that aren't necessarily helping the loyalty picture that we're trying to create, or that we probably need to create in order to be successful in the future. I know for myself, yes, for my annual physical that I schedule months in advance, I do see my actual doctor. But the rest of the time, if I have to go in for something, I'm going to urgent care. If I have to, go to the office, I'm probably being seen by one of the PAs there, someone else. I get very little time with my actual doctor. There's a lot of other people coming through. That one person with whom maybe traditionally I would have had a relationship and would have felt was like my advocate, or the person who was going to help me walk through the healthcare system if I had something more serious going on, there's almost no relationship there anymore. And it's the right thing from a cost perspective for us to be doing, but we haven't backfilled the relationship, which was really at the center of much of our loyalty, with anything else. And so this is something that I think health systems are going to have to take on from a lot of different perspectives. There we go. Um, and it's not something that can happen in any one place to sort of build that loyalty to the brand instead of loyalty to this individual relationship that used to be at the center of healthcare. Navigator programs might need to be expanded. Care managers maybe become that point of relationship with the patient if they're housed within the primary care office, something like that. I mean, there's a lot of different possible levers to pull. Something is going to have to step in there, though. But certainly one piece of that is almost certainly going to be marketing is going to have to expand its role in some ways. And marketing has done a lot of things, right? We build brand, demand capture. So if someone's looking, we need to be there right in front of them at that moment in time. Demand generation, we need to convince someone to schedule a colonoscopy who's wasn't looking to schedule a colonoscopy today, because nobody's really looking to schedule a colonoscopy without some nudging. But the thing that I think there's not nearly enough of, that's going to have to be, I think, a significant part of marketing's role at some point in the future, is to nurture those patient relationships, to build that loyalty, to build that trust in the brand, and to keep people within the system when they seek different kinds of care. All right, that is our first trend. We've got a lot more to cover. Our next trend here is more evolution around user experience. And certainly there are things going on in the design realm. Just for purposes of time, we didn't get much into design trends today. But what we did want to talk about was a growing interest in having a unified experience, at least across digital. We have a growing number of channels that we're using to coordinate with consumers. The web, the portals, apps, emails we send out. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that we connect with consumers on a day-to-day basis. And there's a growing interest in creating an experience across those channels that just makes sense, that leverages each investment that the system is making appropriately, and frankly is consistent, and not just consistent in that you have the same color palette and the same logo in the corner, but actually having some experiential consistency, not having to create a separate login for each piece of this puzzle. you know, having a similar way of approaching the navigation for some of these things, having these things cross-pollinate so that, you know, within the portal, you can actually get to classes that might be useful to you because you have certain diseases or certain conditions that you're dealing with as an individual. And this has turned out to be really, really hard. And the overall experience for consumers has some challenges no matter what, but those third-party components, particularly when they're not particularly flexible, when they don't give you a lot of ability to adapt them to match the rest of the experience that you want to create as an organization, have become real barriers to differentiating your organization from a digital perspective. And the graph here on the right, and you know, the ring chart, is from our friends over at Klein and Partners. They do an incredible survey every year of health consumers. They call it their National Omnibus Study. One of the things that they looked at was consumers' difficulty in completing tasks online. And the outside ring is people who attempted to complete those tasks without accessing the patient portal. And you can see that we have a ways to go. 18% had some difficulty, 2% had major difficulty, 8% said they couldn't complete the task at all, though, and this is my interpretation, not theirs. My guess is a number of those things were things that maybe lived within the portal and they couldn't get into the portal. So they couldn't complete their task because they couldn't take that step because they hadn't jumped through the 8 hoops that have to be jumped through in order to set up a portal account. And you know, within the online experience, in most cases, you can't just sign up for an account and get in and do things, unfortunately. That inner ring, though, is when people access the patient portal. And you would think once you're logged in and we know stuff about you and all those sorts of things that the experience gets better. But that does not appear to be the case from the data that they're getting here. So, you know, actually logging in makes the experience in a lot of ways worse, although at least everyone who managed to get into the patient portal was able to complete the tasks that they were there to become a part of. So these things become a real challenge as organizations are trying to become more thoughtful with the experiences they're creating digitally, more consistent about that experience. And it's certainly not just patient portals. You know, they're I think the most obvious candidate for most of us. But again, you know, looking for instance at insurance sites, health insurance sites, many of those sites are nothing more but a bunch of different third-party components that are all self-contained, that all have different logins, that all have a different look and feel and experience. And you know, it's a huge challenge to create an experience that makes sense. We have maybe less of those pieces within the provider side of the equation, but there's some big ones that are really getting in the way of creating the kind of experience that organizations want to differentiate themselves using digital technology. So what do we do with all that? Like if we want to go and optimize the experience, even if we say, okay, we can't control the patient portal experience at this point, just, you know, there was certainly some serious deficiencies within the experience, even when people didn't access the patient portal. What can we do there? And certainly this is a big program, but I think a lot of organizations go and they're so under-resourced, they get something live and they move on to the next thing. They're firefighting all the time. They're just trying to get the work directly in front of them done. They don't have any time to take a step back and make sure that everything is working as well as it could be. No matter how good you are, no matter how good the vendor agency you work with is, there's a process of optimization that can make these things better in every single case. And very few health systems are taking the time and energy to really optimize the efforts once these things are live. So at the core of that certainly is to have the analytics set up to understand what consumers coming to your site are doing, to really deep dive, build those goal funnels and things like that around the experiences, the key transactions, the key functions, the key use cases within your website, to understand what's working and what's not. And then I really advocate for organizations to spend some time optimizing some of those key experiences for all users. And usually this is some kind of A/B testing, going out there, trying different things, seeing what works and doesn't work, you know, play with imagery, play with placement, play with content, you know, whatever it might be. Go and really work on figuring out how to make those things work better. From there, then you can start to look at personalization. And this is a little bit counterintuitive. I think there's been so much buzz around personalization, so much hope around personalization that folks have thought that it's just going to fix the problems. But if you have a mediocre experience and you start optimizing it with a series of other mediocre experiences that just happen to be slightly more targeted to different audiences, you're not really going to move the needle that much. Part of the problem here as well is that personalization with healthcare within the healthcare web is still at a very early stage. For all the talk that we've had at the conferences and things like that over the last couple of years, and this is data from our Healthcare Digital Marketing Trends Survey, this is the 2018 data. We've just recently opened the 2019 data collection. So again, I hope you'll all get in there and contribute to that information. But we looked at personalization pretty closely last year. And the reality is that very few organizations are doing anything meaningful with personalization, right? They maybe have a little pilot going, but there's either most people are doing nothing, most organizations are doing nothing, and the ones that are, most of them are doing very small things. But doing small things, doing larger things, the reality is this chart right here, which is it making you better? And most folks say no, right? At this point, the use cases that work in e-commerce, that work in travel, that work in media, that work in all these other spaces where these technologies are really established, they are not playing out in the same way in healthcare. They don't work the same way. We have different needs. We have different use cases. People use our sites in different ways. And the tools are, I think, in many cases, having a hard time adapting to the use cases that make sense in healthcare, or we just haven't found where those things can really have the most impact. I wanted to share an example, somewhere where we're starting to see some good results, and that is personalizing the experience around geographic targeting, right? So for many of the systems, particularly when they have a larger footprint, we want to be able to make the location a major factor in what you're seeing. And again, a lot of these tools that are out there, they're good at changing out an image or slapping a banner somewhere, and those things just have such minimal value when you're talking about this geographic targeting. There's a couple of things that work differently here, or we had to make work differently here in order to start to find results that were really making sense for consumers. One of them, and I think we've all gotten used to, the site popping up hey, I want to use your location, and I promise I'm going to make the experience better if you let me know where you are. That's great, and sometimes that works really well, but we found that we needed to give people different ways of setting location, right? That's very unusual. Amazon doesn't care about that. A lot of these sites, it doesn't matter. For healthcare though, just because you're physically sitting in your office right now doesn't mean that that's the center of your healthcare universe. I work 25 miles from home. I don't really need my experience to be personalized around that location. I need to be personalized around my home. Or I find myself often looking for healthcare information for a parent. They're scattered all over the country. Looking at stuff that's based around my location in Iowa really is less than meaningful, less than meaningless rather. It's actually harmful to the experience if that's the way you're trying to personalize things from a geographic perspective. So you need to give people the ability to set the center of their healthcare universe if it doesn't happen to be where they are at this moment. And then from there, again, a lot of the things that we see people personalizing around, swapping out an image here, putting a banner ad there, just doesn't have much impact. It really is something where you have to bake it into the DNA of the experience you're creating. When you search for doctors, it needs to, change the result set based on your location. If you're searching for a practice location, you need to reorder things around that kind of stuff. Even things when you're not actively searching. And so, we've got this technology called Smart Panels. So when you're on a heart and vascular page, it's bringing up heart and vascular doctors, right? Those sorts of things all throughout the site just need to automatically adapt. And again, a lot of the tool sets that are out there don't do this kind of personalization very well. And so it's much harder to do these things in healthcare than in a lot of other spaces that have seen success with these kinds of tools. Now, so long as we're talking about user experience, one of the things I think we have to address again is accessibility. This is one of those things that's sort of vaguely been on the radar for a long time. We've certainly had people with expertise in accessibility for many, many years, but it hasn't always been top of mind for every health system out there. And so it's sort of come to the fore, unfortunately, because of a lot of advocate lawsuits. Folks have been suing organizations to raise the awareness of accessibility issues. And we saw a few of those a little over a year ago, which is why this was a topic last year. There's been a lot of interest, there's been a lot of activity around accessibility here over the last year or so, but the actual lawsuits, the things that I think were bringing this stuff to the fore, have been pretty quiet. And that's what I was prepared to talk about. And then, about 2 weeks ago, Epic was sued by the National Federation of the Blind because their EHR isn't accessible. And so if you think we're kind of past the lawsuit stage of things, I think it's pretty safe to say that's not the case. We still are going to see this kind of work going on out there to make sure that everyone in our industry is focused on this. But the reality is that 19% of Americans have some kind of issue that interferes with their ability to just interact with a web property in the same way that the other 81% of people are. And yes, they have assistive technologies and they have other things, but the way that you build your site, the way you put the content in, all those sorts of things has a huge, huge impact on that. And for the space that we're in, if it's 19% of the American population, I can assure you more than 19% of the people that we serve as a healthcare organization or a healthcare industry are in that boat. And so I think it's the right thing to do as well. But it does bring up this question of how do we address this thing? What's required and so forth. And some of the stuff has become much, much simpler here in the last 2 years. There were competing standards for what it meant to be accessible. Those have largely reconciled. We don't really see that kind of conflict anymore. There were some questions as to whether or not this stuff actually applied in healthcare. Those questions have really been answered, and yes, healthcare organizations really do need to be compliant with these things. Those kinds of questions are out of the way. But now you need to set up some sort of compliance effort. And it's not something that buying the right content management system fixes, although the content management system that you have can make this problem much easier or much harder to solve. It's not something where you can just go through a process and bam, you're compliant from then on forward. Yes, you need a process to make sure that you're in compliance, but you need an ongoing compliance program to make sure that you're monitoring, that you're not doing things that move you further away from compliance, and that you continue to do the right thing over the long haul. One of the large misconceptions that we see there is that buying some sort of scanning tool, some sort of reporting tool on this solves that problem for you. And the tools out there, I mean, some of them anyway, are great. They'll scan your site, they'll bring back all kinds of alerts. But from there, you still need someone who understands accessibility, who can go through those, can review them, identify if it's a false positive or if it's a true issue that you have there. And to be totally fair, the best tools out there right now are still only covering about a third of the WCAG, the WCAG guidelines. There's still a need to have a person go through, review things, audit things, at least on a periodic basis, to make sure that you're as in compliance as you can be. And so it really is a program that requires a lot of different facets to be fully effective with. All right, next trend here, consumerism. And it's weird still to be talking about consumerism as a trend. It feels like, we've been talking about the consumerism wave that's coming for about 10 years. And I think the end of the day, what we've had is it's a tide that's been gradually creeping up on us. But it's here, and it's here because we've forced consumers to have more skin in the game. High deductible plans, just get plans that aren't labeled as high deductibles, but deductibles have just gotten a lot higher. Average deductibles have more than doubled in the last 10 years. We've gotten consumers' attention. They're saying, okay, we're engaged, we understand, we need to be more active in making decisions. And so we're at a point now where, some $330 billion annually in out-of-pocket healthcare expenses are driven by consumer choice, right? So they're like, okay, we understand we have choices to make, but we're really poorly armed to actually make choices, right? We've now engaged consumers who have very low levels of health literacy and told them they need to make life and death decisions, and it's a really scary place for them to be. So this research is a couple years old now. This is from 2006, although I'm not sure that I've seen any like national movement that makes me feel like that number's moved a lot. But in 2006, the Department of Education determined that only 12% of adults had proficient health literacy. And that sounds like a fairly bad number. And then you realize that at that point in time, 11% of US adults worked in healthcare. So if you thought it was a depressing number before, it's a bad level of understanding of healthcare out there today. And to be totally fair, it's not that 1% of people who don't work in healthcare are proficient in health literacy. I suspect that there's a few people working in healthcare that are also not health literate. But nevertheless, it's a place that really tells us that we need to provide much better tools and education, so at the point when people care, the point when they need to make a decision, that we're arming them with good information in order to make the best choices for themselves. And let me show you what this means. And this is another example coming more from the insurance side of the house, from our friends at Barclay USA. They did some research a year or so ago around how millennials make certain kinds of healthcare choices. And when they're looking at health coverage, the number one factor they look at is cost. But when they look at making care decisions, it's the bottom of the list. It is the lowest factor for them. And again, this shouldn't necessarily be a huge surprise to us, because when you're buying health coverage, the cost, or at least that monthly cost, maybe not the total cost of everything you're going to have, the cost is the simplest thing to understand. It's right there in front of you. And frankly, a lot of the other details are kind of overwhelming. When you're making care decisions, the cost oftentimes is only something you have if you work really, really hard to get it. And even then, you might not have it. And so it's no surprise that that's so low on the list, because it's a factor that's almost impossible for them to get their hands on. So we address this, as an industry, through what we've referred to as transparency, right? We need to give people more information. And Geonetric, we've thought of transparency for a long time as a three-legged stool, looking at quality, looking at experience, looking at pricing. In an ideal world, a consumer would see all of these things in context together and be able to balance out what things are more important to them, what things are less important to them, make decisions based on that. Right? I might be willing, if I'm super price sensitive, to deal with moderate quality and kind of a very complex experience in order to save myself big money on, I don't know, a knee replacement. If I can save myself $15,000 on a knee replacement, I'm willing to hop on a plane and fly to Central America in order to have that surgery done. That is a trade-off we see people making when they can see it. But oftentimes we don't have all that information, and we certainly don't have it in a way where we can really compare options in an apples to apples kind of way. We're making progress here, though. Over the last couple of years, we've seen big movement in our ability to tell the experience story. And some of that's data collection, right? HCAHPS, CGCAHPS, stuff like that, where we're surveying in a systematic way the experience that consumers have with our systems. And increasingly, we're putting that data out there attached to our doctors and our locations and our organization. For a long time, we've published all kinds of quality information. It can be a little bit cryptic, but there are enough sites out there that have taken our hospital-acquired infection rates and our STEMI times and all these other things and rolled it up into a 1 to 5 star rating around a particular service line or for an organization. That data is out there, and in large part, at least, is translated to something that consumers can often understand and wrap their heads around. The one that's been most complicated for the provider side to address is pricing. And that's one that's getting some attention now, and we'll talk about a little bit more here in a moment. But before we get into pricing, I wanted to talk about a risk that we see out there in this kind of rating and review world that we've started to jump into as organizations. And that is that the manipulation of these rating and review systems has just gotten completely out of hand. It's been a problem for a long time at some level, but I know I've had a couple of experiences in the last year or so where I buy something on Amazon, and in retrospect, every review on there was clearly fabricated. It was clearly, manipulated. The product was nothing like what I thought it was going to be. And last year, and you may or may not be podcast people, but there's a podcast called Reply All. It's a great podcast about the internet. There was a episode called The Magic Store, where they really dug into why it seems like Amazon in particular has started to get a lot sketchier, and really go through the groups out there where people are buying reviews with product or cash. How companies are holding refunds hostage to people removing bad reviews. I mean, it is a system that's so powerful that it's inevitable that it was going to get manipulated, and the manipulation is such right now that I think we could start to see a more systematic crisis of confidence around these ratings and reviews. And it's been such a powerful tool for our organizations. I think that is a real risk to us, but unfortunately, it's really going to be up to the Amazons and Googles of the world to figure out how to police this stuff more effectively. And in the absence of that, I think we could see this become a much less effective tool for us in the future. Anyway, the third leg of the stool, pricing transparency. This is one that has been talked about a lot. I'd say over the last 3 or 4 years, anytime that I was sitting down with, the CEO or, senior leaders of a healthcare organization and talked to them about the big things that they're thinking about and hoping about for the future, somewhere on that list has been pricing transparency. And in almost every case, the number of things that they've been able to do to actually affect that, to make pricing transparency a tool that for their organization has been a very short list. And frankly, the government's been a little bit frustrated at our industry's ability to move forward on this as well. And so last year, CMS put out some new rules that went into effect January 1 that said you need to be more transparent about your prices. And when you read the narrative around this, it's fantastic. It's everything you always wanted, right? Consumers are upset because they can't see pricing, because they go under the knife and then the anesthesiologist was off of their insurance plan. The goals were all right, and then the actual thing that they did, that they're requiring us to do out of this rulemaking, really hits none of those goals, right? And so what they're telling us we need to do is we need to publish charge master data in the machine readable format, and that's CSV or an XML file, not some interactive tool, not a PDF. It's something that's machine readable, and you need to update it at least yearly. And there's a lot more detail behind that, but those are kind of the big components there. There are no requirements for human readability, or even if the file is findable, it just needs to be published technically to the internet in some way. So really, I think they've fallen short at this level. I think the goal here in their eyes is actually more that they don't trust health systems to put this data out in a way that allows consumers to compare. So by publishing it in a way that can be consumed by computers, other players can come in, pull that data, and build comparison tools between them. But you and I know that the fact that they're using charge master data in this makes it all but useless for a typical consumer. Consumers want to know what their out-of-pocket costs are going to be. And it's a much, much more complicated question that requires a lot of information about their insurance plan and what they've already done during the year and so on and so forth. With all that in mind, I think at least the conversation about what we should be doing to put pricing out there for consumers has started to move forward because of the actions of CMS. And I know that we've got some pilot programs that we're exploring with some clients right now to try to do some more of that here in 2019. So we do see this as something that's likely to continue to move forward with a little bit of push from CMS, even though the things that we actually had to do for CMS weren't actually all that useful. All right. Our last one, and it's a biggie, is the shifting world of findability and traffic and audiences. And this is the stuff that last year we referred to more from an SEO perspective. SEO is a piece of that, but I think it's also a little bit limiting. And so I think we need to think more holistically about how we are bringing people in at those moments in time when they want to engage with us. And competing with us for that has been a movement by a number of companies, and this is something that I've talked about a little bit over the last couple of years. Companies like Facebook, like Google, and to a lesser extent Microsoft and Apple, and have been trying to, instead of just be a key tool in the internet, are trying to become the internet, or at least they're trying to become what AOL was 20 years ago, before the internet was widely available. Right? You go to AOL and that is your universe. Well, Google would like that Google to be your universe. Facebook would like Facebook to be your universe. Like, they are increasingly keeping people within the fold. The world of lots and lots of free traffic from these sites has gone away or is going away. We've seen that pretty dramatically from Facebook, and they've been pretty open about it. Right, they have gradually, in steps over the past few years, tightened the spigot of free organic traffic, of organic reach to consumers, and they've said, look, we're just not going to give you as much of this stuff for free. And it should be no surprise, right? I mean, they've sort of saturated the market. The growth in the number of people, or the audience for Facebook, it doesn't grow that much. It's already so big. But they need to deliver more money quarter after quarter. And so the way that they do that is they make more of us pay to play. And because they're a monopoly, because we kind of have to be there, we're all doing it, and we're going to continue to do it in the future. A name that might not be that familiar to many of you, Drew Curtis. He runs a site called Fark. It's a sort of news aggregator site. Has been an outspoken critic of being dependent on these third parties for your traffic, and he has been for a long time. He was talking about this before Facebook started to close things down, and he's saying the same things about Google now. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that we're seeing these same kinds of behavior from Google. Google's just much more subtle about it. So, he basically said, hey, if you grew your traffic fast using Facebook and you basically handed over this function to them, you are now dependent upon them. And the day that they change the algorithm, you're in a world of hurt. And this is exactly what he's seeing from Google as well. And we've been watching over the last couple of years really closely to see that. We've certainly seen behaviors that start to suggest that. But this was the presentation that I saw recently that really kind of drove home that it's been happening, but we just haven't had the visibility to Google, and frankly, Google is just much better at making it subtle. So this is Rand Fishkin, who, if you don't know, founded Moz, the SEO company Moz. He's since departed that company. He's got some other startups. And the amazing thing is he's been able to start to attach data to some of the behavioral things that we've kind of felt like were probably happening, but were a little hard to see in the numbers that we had from our own sites. When we look at a SERP page, right, it used to be you had a couple ads at the top or on the right, and then you had a whole list of organic search results. And now there are so many other things that these sites are putting out there, the Google's putting out there about the site, that it becomes very, very difficult to actually get to what we traditionally thought of as organic search results. And there was no way to get an example that showed all these things, and many of these things do lead to the actual site in question. But there's more and more things where they're answering questions, they're delivering content directly, they're pulling in social stuff, they're pushing you to other Google properties, right? It's almost impossible to find video on Google that's not YouTube video, right? And so Google is sending you to more Google in those scenarios. And so this sort of thing suggests to us that Google is controlling and routing and moving traffic in different ways than what we've seen before. And we can look at that and kind of think to ourselves, well, I haven't seen that. And so we'll explain kind of why it's not so obvious that this has been the case. Anyway, these are some of the numbers that Rand Fishkin has been sharing. And from the desktop perspective, the portions of things have not shifted. And we should say the desktop search has been very, very stable over the last several years. Google, again, has been pretty quiet about total traffic, total searches, but it appears that search levels for desktop are very stable, maybe even declining a little bit if we're just looking at the United States. And the way that people are interacting with them, in terms of organic versus just getting their answer on the site, and when that column that's no clicks basically means someone ran a search on Google and never left Google. They got their answer somewhere within Google. Hasn't shifted that much either. So, you've got about, 2/3 that are generating an organic click, about a third that are no clicks. This isn't taking into account the paid stuff. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The mobile side, though, as we start to look at that, that's where the action's happening. That's where some things are really changing in big ways. So we looked in 2016 and we had this, roughly 60-40 split. 60% of searches were yielding an organic click. About 40% of searches, people were getting their answer right on Google. So right off the bat, even 2 years ago, significantly more people not leaving Google to get their answers when they're on mobile. But we see by 2018 that ratio has flipped, right? That's 60% of people are getting their answers on Google. Only 40% are actually clicking through to a site. So today on mobile, for every 2 searches that yield an organic click, there are 3 searches where people get the answer directly in Google. And again, we look at our numbers and we say, I haven't seen this huge drop off in traffic. And that's because mobile searches continue to grow. And this is predicted data. As I said, Google doesn't publish the search volumes every month. They're not that open about some of this kind of stuff. These are someone's predicted numbers, and I think particularly for since 2017 on, I think they're probably a little overzealous because they don't take into account cannibalization of searches by voice search, which is a whole other topic. We talked about that more last year. But the fact of the matter is, mobile searches have grown a lot. What is less obvious to us is, the 1% or 2% or 4% growth that we're seeing in mobile traffic from Google year over year is only a small part of the growth in searches, that Google is actually eating most of the growth in traffic that they're getting from the mobile side. And that's how they're fueling their growth. They've also gotten much, much better through this whole process at getting paid for the things they're doing. So the numbers, this goes back to 2016 through the fall of 2018. Click-through rates, they were lower for mobile than they were for desktop. That was a real problem as mobile was growing very rapidly. But you see along the way on the desktop, Google's been able to boost those clicks by maybe 50%, getting up into the 6% plus range on a few occasions. That red line, though, the mobile stuff, they've been able to bring it way, way up, and much higher click-through rates on ads on mobile than on desktop. So again, part of the message here is pay to play is going to have to be a piece of the puzzle. To put this in context in some different ways, looking across everything, for every 10 searches that yield organic clicks, there's almost 9 searches, like 8.8, something like that are no-click searches, where people are getting their answer on Google across mobile, across desktop, across everything. Looking at organic versus paid, in 2018, every paid click that you get out there, every search that yields a paid click, there are 15 searches that end in an organic click, which seems like a fine ratio until you realize that in 2017, that ratio was 20 to 1. So they've gotten much, much better at pushing traffic to paid instead of organic. All right, a lot of data. I know when I started to really sift through this, mind-blown kind of thing, but it brings up the question: does this mean that SEO is dead? Does this mean it's no longer part of the toolkit? Do we just have to buckle down and say it's all paid all the time? And fortunately, the answer is no. It's not yet. I mean, but no. Organic search engine optimization is still very, very important. But if it's the only tool in your toolkit, if putting quality content out there and hoping that you can get traffic from that through the magic of organic search, if that's the only tool you're using, you really need to take a step back and look at the whole portfolio of things you're doing in a much more holistic way. And most of us have seen something along these lines, right? There's different places that people come from. and we tend to balance these things off each other, right? We've got earned, which is that SEO stuff. In the traditional world, that's PR and things like that, versus paid, right? Going and paying for ads on Google and Facebook, boosted posts, all those sorts of things. There's going to have to be more of a balance there than there's been in the past. Plan to spend more on paid advertising than you have in the past. And then there's own channels and borrowed channels, a little less of that going on in healthcare, but putting content other places where people go, certainly a good tactic. But we need to also think about growing our own channels. And for us, that's a lot of that is our email channels. And frankly, getting people to come directly to our sites without going through a search first. We need to look at all of those things together. When we do look at SEO, though, it's really important that we're optimizing for the right things. I see a lot of energy spent on looking at the content that we've developed and trying to optimize that instead of looking at consumers and figuring out where we need to be and then developing the content, the functionality, and optimizing that for those moments in time. And so I think there's a real need to make sure you're focusing your efforts in the right places. And this is an idea that Google's been talking about for a while, the idea of micro moments. And not totally new, I'll try and go through this fairly quickly. I know I'm running a little short on time, but Google has a number of different thoughts. The I want to know moments, when someone is exploring or researching, but not necessarily in a purchasing mode, we need to put out the content that satisfies those needs. And we do see lots of research where people are spending more time in that researching mode before they're in the decision-making mode, and oftentimes by the time they get to the decision-making mode, much of their decisions are already made. The I want to go moment, so where local search, business listing management, Google My Business listings, location strategies, making sure that Google is clear on what services you have and where you can get them. I want to do moments, so helping people connect with different capabilities, finding a physician, getting directions, making a recipe, right? Lots of those sorts of things, great points of engagement. And of course, we need to be able to generate lots and lots of transactions. And when people want to interact with us digitally, we need to make sure that they have the ability to do that 24/7, 365. In order to get those moments out there, is going to require more journey mapping, and not like one journey map for patients generically at your hospital. It's going to have to get more focused around different use cases, in some cases around individual disease states, but really understanding how people go about searching, how they find, where they're at, what the process looks like, and making sure that you have the right content and functionality to address their needs at each step of that journey. And finally, the last strategy for addressing this stuff is to play the Google game. Google is still the dominant player here, and they have a real bias for their own stuff. So make sure that the way that your things are being presented when people search for them on Google is correct. That's directory management problem, that's local search optimization, again, Google My Business, all these sorts of things. It's much more heavy use of schema to make sure that the search engine isn't guessing at the things on your pages. And it's using Google's properties well. So if you're doing video, don't go ahead and launch some other video service or some kind of server or something like that. Just put it on YouTube, because that's what Google is returning for video results. Make sure that you're putting the mapping data into Google and so on and so forth. So sometimes it's not so much about finding ways around this, but just making sure that you're engaging with what they've got there. And so with that, we do have a few minutes left for questions. We do have a question or two already, but you can enter questions in the Q&A box on the GoToWebinar space there. But I'll go ahead and dive right in. I recognize that we're a little short on time. The first question that we had relates to AMP pages. Okay, so with all the stuff on Google, why not AMP pages? Why are you talking about AMP pages? Okay, so if you don't know, AMP is accelerated mobile pages. This is kind of a trimmed down version of HTML that you can put pages out there as sort of an alternative format, and Google caches those pages. And so when you search and you find something, depending on the type of content and the context, sometimes Google serves the page directly from its cache rather than going to your site. this is used a lot for news right now, and mostly, I would say mostly for news right now. It's limiting because you can't put a lot of things around that. You can't put ads, you can't put, calls to action. Like, it's really very limiting. Um, and it's maybe one of the more controversial things in this universe of play nice with Google if you want to be ranked by Google. I see it right now primarily as a way for them to combat paywalls on media sites, and really, like, maybe for sort of content hub content, the content marketing content, maybe there's a place for that. But right now we're being pretty conservative about going too far down the AMP road. It's unclear, um, how much of an impact it can have for sites like ours. And to be totally fair, uh, we're just not totally sold on its role as part of the package. Um, let's see here. Our next, are you seeing increased use of chat or chatbots as systems work to enhance the patient experience? Yes. So that was one that for time's sake didn't quite make it in. We see a huge amount of chat being used in general, right? If you look at the top couple of chat applications versus the top couple of social networks, certainly globally, in the US, I think a bit as well, but like, the number of people using chat like blows the number of people using social out of the water, and the amount of interaction there is astounding. So people want to interact this way. I do think that there is a strong role for, sort of branded conversations, interacting with people through these different chat applications and things like that. I'm not sure that I mean, we're seeing more use of the, like, chat with an agent kind of thing on hospital websites, not necessarily seeing huge use of those capabilities yet. But I think it's an interesting alternative way to navigate some of this, and I think it's a place where AI can play a huge role as well. And so, companies like Loyal are getting into that in a pretty big way. And I think there's some really interesting technology there. I'm not sold that it's sort of changing the experience for the majority of visitors yet, but I do see these kinds of interfaces put in different places as being really impactful. I spoke at a Blue Cross Blue Shield conference earlier this year, um, and was talking with one of the Blues, and they actually have some big investments in AI chatbot stuff at this point. But they're saying that no one's interacting with it through their apps, no one's interacting with it through their website, but they're using it extensively in Facebook. And so, the right place, the right application, I think it can be a powerful addition to the tool set. If you've got a lot of deficiencies other places in terms of what you're putting out there, um, I think I would focus the energy and attention in other places at this point. But I think there's a lot of potential there for organizations that are really knocking it out of the park on most of the major components, and they're just looking to take it up a level. I think that could be great. Um, Last question that we'll have time for here today: how do you begin to map a patient's online journey before they get to your website? Do you simply track online ads to your site for starters? And the answer is that's really complicated. So there are some ways to look at what that journey looks like. Some of that comes from interviews, some of that comes from some third-party data sources. There's a lot of pieces to that. But I think the important thing is it's possible to do if you prioritize it. But you do need to, probably get out from behind analytics and do some other things in order to gather that kind of information. So thank you all. If there are additional questions, we will communicate with people individually, or if there's enough things, maybe we'll write a blog post to answer some additional questions. I do want to remind you that in February, we have a great webinar coming up talking about kickstarting your content marketing. And again, one of those big trends, we see a lot of organizations getting into this and having some great success in that space. And then please do go out, genetec.com/digital trends. Take the survey. If you're a vendor and you're like, hey, we're a vendor, we have a set of questions for vendors. some of our greatest insights over the last year came from comparing what people inside healthcare organizations had to say on a topic versus what the vendors and agencies that work with them have to say on a particular topic. So go out there, take it. Again, there's an Amazon gift card for taking the survey and completing it. Share it with your friends, and I hope that later this year you'll come and hear about what we learned from that as well. And everybody stay warm and have a great rest of the week.